Hi class, I am just giving an update here. I've wanted to do more updates throughout the video and interactive updates throughout the class, but I've had software on my iPad that keeps failing. I've tried multiple times and it keeps messing up, and I think there's some quirks in the apps that I downloaded. So they're relatively new, so I'm hoping in the next semester or two those get worked out. And unfortunately, you guys won't benefit from that with this class, but hopefully maybe with some others, with other profs. But anyway, I want to go through in this video the first ISA announcements. My desire is that I'm seeing that a lot of you guys are making simple but critical mistakes on some of them. Not really on ISA 1 and 2, but mostly ISA 3 and then some of the later ones, and I'm going to post some updates on those. My desire is that I want you guys to have, like I said, I'm going to give you the extra time to do updates on your assignments. So I'm not going to give extra credit for this course, but I am going to allow you to update the stuff you've turned in and give you an extra week to do that. However, the key is what I want to get away from is you guys turning things in, me grading it, giving you a grade, and then you redoing it and getting an updated grade. For most of the stuff here, I want to, that I've gone through now, instead of posting what I've graded, I want to have you choose whether you're going to resubmit it, if that makes sense. So I think the easiest way to do that is for me to give you some details of more of what I'm looking for in some of these assignments. And if you didn't do those things, you'll know that you need to go and resubmit it. Does that make sense? So as always, feel free to email me or call me if you want to talk by phone, and we'll go from there. But first of all, on ISA 1, which was the either the notes or the background. Let me just pull it up here. Full grade center. Give me a second. So yeah, ISA 1 was the background summary assignment. So on that, I'm not going to go over ISA 1 and 2 that much, but the background summary, most all of you did really well, and I gave you notes if you need to update those at all. In fact, I'm not actually letting you update 1 and 2, am I? I put that in the email. But basically what I was looking for was that you interacted with Silva. Some of you treated it like you were just talking about Philippians, and the idea was that you were interacting with Silva's commentary on Philippians, or his introduction. And so some of you missed a few points on that. The notes was just basically you put the effort in, you answered the questions thoroughly enough, you did fine. And most of you did really well on that. So that's ISA 1 and 2. Now, ISA 3 was the narrative analysis. I'm just going to go through that question by question. Ideally on these, I give you, in this case, 4 pieces. Discuss the plot of the narrative according to the categories provided in Klein and or in the course notes. So things like the background, the climax, things like that. The big thing there is make sure you use those categories. Some of you just kind of talked about the plot of the narrative like off the top of your head, and we're doing a narrative analysis here, so you need to use narrative analysis type terms. And if you did that, you did fine. If you didn't, I marked you down quite a bit. Each section here is worth 20 points. So, if you talked about the plot but didn't really talk about anything to do with the background and climax and things like that, things that go into a narrative background, you need to do that. The next part is characters. So describe the characters in Genesis 22 according to those provided in Klein in the course notes. So things like protagonist, antagonist. So you're going to want to talk about all the characters. Some of you didn't even talk about all the characters. Make sure to do that. Some of you talked about the characters and what role they played, but you didn't mention whether they were an antagonist or protagonist. And you really need to do that to get full credit here. Some of you weren't quite sure what role God played, which there is some tension there. So you don't have to dub God as a specific role. So you've got some flexibility there. And you also don't have to find an antagonist. So be sure you're not forcing things that aren't actually there. It could be you got a protagonist, and then you could have something like an antagonist, which is maybe Abraham's potential lack of faith, something like that. Feel that out, and I want you to show your thought and input into this, and not just, regurgitated information. So give me a little bit of your thought process there, where there's some tension. Then elements of time. What portions of the narrative go by faster than others, which go by slower? So again, here, some of you, again, just generically talked about how some of it was fast and some of it wasn't. I'm looking for you to give some details and specifics. So what about gaps in the passage, for instance? So there's some gaps in like verses 1, 4, 9, and then there's a couple others. So the first gap, let's say, verse 4. You're seeing that you skipped 3 days between God's instruction to Abraham and the last part of the journey to the mountain for the sacrifice. That's a gap in time. So that's an element of time, for an example. There's a lot of acceleration in the story. So things like the majority, let me just read something I had written to some of you guys. The majority of both the action and the dialogue takes place on the mountain, and the large time gaps between the instruction to Abraham and the sacrifice make the story move along very quickly. The first half of the narrative, although it contains dialogue, moves very quickly and intentionally. It is clear that the entire beginning half of the story is trying to get the reader to the point of the sacrifice. There's some other stuff you can go along with on that dynamic, but what I'm trying to get you to do is give me a feel for how does the narrative move, and then you can see at the end, are there any open-ended questions? If you're visualizing what's happening here in this story, where, if this was like a movie, where are they moving really quickly? Are they taking a lot of time here, maybe on showing what's happening during the sacrifice, and then all of a sudden, they're here? These are types of things that you want to make reference of. Some of you did really well. Some of you guys, just really briefly touched on this, and it's really hard for me to see if you understood those concepts. So those are elements of time, and so I want you to basically point out specifically what goes by faster and what goes by slower. You're going to have to think through and prove it. That's the big thing many of you don't do. You say something, but then you don't prove it with how the narrative actually went. So if you're making a claim, it went by fast when Abraham did this, well then quote the verse and explain to me how that works. Does that make sense? So that's what I'm looking for there. Now, analyzing the dialogue. The biggest thing that will help you here when you're analyzing dialogue is when there's dialogue, meaning when someone is quoted in speaking something, quote it and then talk about it. It's not going to do you very much help to just kind of talk about how their conversations went without actually giving me specifics. So, for instance, God speaks to Abraham in the very beginning of the story. He first calls Abraham, then Abraham replies, "Here I am," to the Lord. God then tells Abraham to go and sacrifice his son. You can give a lot of detail on every piece of dialogue. Then Abraham speaks to his two servants. Explain that. Again, what role does it play? So you're telling me what the dialogue is, and then you're explaining what role that plays in the narrative. The angel of the Lord speaks to Abraham. So again, explain what he said, what that exchange was, what role does that play, and then so that type of thing. So that is the dialogue, and then finally, in one paragraph, provide a preliminary interpretation of the passage. Be sure to include a statement declaring what you believe is the main point of the narrative and the reasons for your decision. Now, many of you are going to simply say things like faith or obedience. Those are definitely aspects that are both true and good to this story. What I'm trying to get you out of and to up the ante a little bit is we are most of us ingrained in church culture to read a story like this and, okay, and Abraham, oh, what amazing faith he had, or obedience to the Lord, that sort of thing. That is true. But what have you learned from this class and from studying this narrative that you can now say in an interpretive manner about this section that you wouldn't have been able to say before you did this study or before you took this class? So things like, how would the original audience have read into this story? When you read Abraham and his faith or his obedience to the Lord, what you're actually wanting to determine is, how did this play into the ongoing interaction with God and Israel? Okay? The original audience are Israelites, and they're reading this into an ongoing story of Israel's history. So the Jewish audience would find much more significance beyond just purely the principle that we need to be faith-filled people or obedient people to God. So I want you to play that into it. And you can also tie back into God's original promise to Abraham, and then he makes another promise here. And many of you don't even mention that. The culminating factor of this entire section is in a promise. I give you a huge hint, that should be something you camp out on in an interpretation of this passage. So I hope that helped quite a bit as you make your updates to ISA number 3. And sorry I went on a little bit long here, but hopefully those details will help you. And again, if you have any questions, let me know. Thanks.